Okay, so everybody, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Bernard Ricca from the Lida Hill Institute of Human Resilience at University of Colorado Springs. Professor Ricca is an expert in many areas of data science, applied mathematics, and dynamical systems. He is particularly interested in data applications to the social and the life sciences. As a matter of fact, I think he's currently still probably past president now because there's been the election, but president of the Society for Chaos Theory in the Psychology and Life Sciences. And he likes everything which is nonlinear and chaotic. And today he's going to put some order into dynamical system data science and the social and behavioral sciences. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to have you in the seminar series.
Great. Okay, well, thank you for allowing me to be there virtually tonight. I can't obviously be there in person, but yeah, we'll get past that. What I'd like to do is, let's start this thing. I think it doesn't work. As he said, I'm Barney Ricca. I'm going to talk tonight about dynamical systems approaches in the data sciences, and specifically in the social and behavioral sciences, because that's sort of where I lie and have been for most of the last 30 years, because I've been in education and psychology for most of that time. But a lot of what I say will apply elsewhere. Roughly we'll do this. We'll have a brief introduction here, a little bit about me and a little bit about what I think about you. We'll talk about dynamical systems for about 10 minutes. We'll also then talk a little bit about social and behavioral sciences and how those differ from what you might be familiar with in the physical, mathematical, or engineering sciences. A lot of stuff falls in between there. Economics, finance, things like that are someplace in between those two, but we'll figure it out. And we'll talk particularly about latent variables and classes because those tend to be new to people. And then we'll spend hopefully about half the time talking on 3 different examples. And the examples that we'll look at have to do with what's called dynamical systems analysis, which is unfortunately named because the entire thing is dynamical systems analysis. We'll talk about a technique known as sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics, referred to as SINDY. And we'll talk about Markov or transition matrices, and then we'll have some time for question and answers afterwards. So, a bit about me. My formal background is in physics and mathematics, although I learned to program computers a very long time ago. My first computer science course actually used what are known as hollerith or punch cards. You can look them up if you don't know what those are. But because I've always applied these areas, the math, the physics, the computer science, to places like education and psychology, I've basically been a data scientist forever, long before we said there were such things as data science. After finishing my PhD, I got into STEM education. I was a former secondary school teacher, math and physics. And then I eventually migrated into being statistics and data science full-time. And for the last 4 years, I've been a trauma researcher at the Lida Hill Institute for Human Resilience. Tonight, we're going to take sort of a medium-high level overview of the topic. It'll be high level because I'm not going to do any proofs. I'm not going to do any derivations, things like that. I'm not going to show you any code. But it'll be medium level because I'm going to do specific examples. However, if you want code, I've got code. We can do that. I mostly code in R and then C or C++ because those are the things I'm most familiar with and I do a lot of. I do some Python and some MATLAB because I have collaborators who do that sort of stuff. And I have some assumptions that I'm making about you. First, I'm going to assume that you're reasonably well-versed in multivariate linear regression models, right? You know how to estimate them and interpret them. You might even remember some of the stuff that you've learned about the assumptions of regression and normality of normality of residuals and independent and identically distributed and things like that, homoscedasticity and things. From that, you really should be good at slopes and intercepts. Beyond that, I don't really care. I'm also going to assume that you've had a physics or physical science course someplace in high school or college, so velocity and acceleration aren't brand new to you. Because we need to know the difference between change and rates of change. And you might even know something about mathematical derivatives, but I'm not going to ask you to find any or calculate or anything like that, although I will use that term several times. And we'll talk about that for those of you who need to do that. And lastly, you know the difference between interval or ratio data and ordinal or categorical data. You know better than to add or average or anything like that ordinal data, even though we do it all the time in the behavioral sciences. It still drives me crazy that we do things that way. So what are dynamics? One definition of dynamical systems is this. Dynamical system is a set of possible states together with a rule that determines the present state in terms of the past states. Another way of putting that is dynamics is talking about if you know where you are now, where are you going to be later? Okay, given where you are now, what's going to happen later? And there's a nice book by Zanil et al. That came out last year talking about dynamical systems, and this is where it's taken from. So a state is going to be a measurement or a set of measurements, and we'll call those things components, that determine a system's functioning or behavior. And I'll give you some examples in a minute that'll make that a little bit more clear. Rules are sort of recognizing the states in terms of their past states, not states in terms of time. And that becomes very important because a lot of times we do things, we plot, for example, X versus time instead of tomorrow's state against today's state. When you do things like plot tomorrow's state against today's state, we're talking about things like state space. And state space plots push time to the background. Doesn't eliminate time, we still need time, but we kind of push it out of the way so we don't look at it. Zanil goes on to say, and in fact on the following page of that book, that dynamics is really about any equation where you can say the derivative of X, and I'm using a notation with X with that little over dot to mean derivative, the rate of change. Dynamics are anything where you can say the rate of change of X, the derivative of X with respect to time, is some function of X. So that's going to be really our starting point. And I said I'd be using derivatives. There's one right there. Okay? We need it for the notations. So some examples of dynamical systems. Population is a great dynamical system because you can talk about the number or the density of prey and the number or density of predators as being the states. And clearly in something like this, the density of prey determines something about next year's density of predators, because if there's no prey around, the predators are not going to find anything. And likewise, the number of predators this year determines something about the number of prey next year. They kill them off if there's too many of them. Weather. One of the classic things is the weather model from Edward Lorenz, where the horizontal and vertical temperature gradients, that is how fast the temperature changes from top to bottom or east to west, and the rate of convection, tell you something about how the weather behaves. We can talk about health. Every time you go to a physician, you see things like take their blood pressure, the heart rate, your body mass index, and things. These aren't really so causal, and so they may not be the best state measures, but they use them for something other than dynamics. We can talk about human locomotion, right? All the walking and running and jumping and whatever else you do. The joint angles and the muscle tensions or the extensions of the muscles are really good examples of things, and what the muscle does now determines the joint angle later and things like that. This turns out to be a really excellent archetype for looking at dynamical systems. So if you wanted to, there's a book by Esther Thalen and Linda Smith. It's about 30 years old now, Dynamical Systems Approach to the Understanding of Cognition and Action. And especially the first 4 chapters of that thing are just a brilliant, brilliant introduction to dynamical systems in general. So you really should think about looking at that if you have interest in dynamical systems. For me, I spend a lot of time with post-trauma studies, people who've survived wildfires, hurricanes, sexual assault, things like that, where we talk about things like self-efficacy, the belief that you can do something. Post-traumatic stress, you may have heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The impact of stressful events. How much are you impacted by an event that happens today? And any perceived, for example, post-traumatic growth. Oh, because of the trauma, I am better at this, that, or the other. And things are theorized to work in a particular way that these drive one another. And we'll be back to this one in a little while. But it's not just the measures that are important, but the rates of change, the velocities are important, right? It's not just the change. In a 100-meter dash, everybody runs the 100 meters, but only one person wins. And the person who wins is the one who has the highest rate of change, the highest velocity. Rates of change can also have rates of change themselves. We can talk about accelerations, and then we can talk about that would be the second derivative. The first derivative would be the velocity. I had an old Mercedes diesel that would do 0 to 60 sometime today. And so it really did not have a very great rate of acceleration. And notice we're using rates of change and derivatives interchangeably. We shouldn't do it, and we'll talk about that briefly later. But for now, we'll say derivatives. The level, the thing you measure, x, is the 0th derivative. The velocity is the first derivative, the acceleration is the second derivative, and so on and so forth. Very rarely in the sciences do you need more than 2 derivatives, but there are things that are out there. The third derivative is called the jerk, and the fourth, fifth, and sixth are called snap, crackle, and pop. And so you can do that if you need to. The terminology is a bit loose in the social and behavioral sciences. And those of you who are of a more mathematical bent, it will start to drive you a little crazy. In the social behavioral sciences, we talk about local derivatives, which really means estimates of rates of change or estimates of the derivatives. Okay? But they call them local derivatives. Sometimes they just call them derivatives, and they shouldn't do it, but they do. Because this is statistics, there's a need to estimate those quantities then. We don't measure derivatives hardly ever. There's very few places in the social behavioral sciences where we directly measure velocity or acceleration, so we have to estimate them. The question is there a best method for estimating them? And the answer is there are many methods for estimating derivatives. However, there's probably no one best method. I think this is one of these cases of what Wolpert, and I forget Wolpert's first name, called the no free lunch theorem. You don't know a priori what algorithm is the best for doing anything in a nonlinear world. There are more interesting concepts in dynamical systems. The system can be multi-stable, that is, we can have different outcomes for the same independent variable. The variance can be a signal as well as a nuisance, right? And changes in variance can be a warning of an impending change, a phase change. But for now, we'll just stick with derivatives tonight. If it was a whole course, we could do more. So here's your calculus survival slide for those of you who don't know calculus. For those of you who are good at calculus, you can just kind of let your mind wander until we get to the next slide. So in dynamics, states depend upon previous states, which means we need time series data. If we don't have time series data, we're not doing dynamics. We need to estimate the slope, specifically the velocity for us tonight, but it's also the acceleration and other slopes. And m is always the slope because it's been the slope since whenever. It's the change in x over change in t, which is, right, x now minus x then over t now minus t then. This is just the slope formula from algebra. Right? But suppose now that this interval, time now minus time then, gets to be so small that you can't tell then and now apart. Right? If you can't tell those apart because they are so close together, the slope becomes the derivative. And there's lots of, as the limit as h approaches 0 and all sorts of mathematics involved in that. But as far as we're concerned, if the interval is small enough, it's the derivative. That's all we need. The rest of this is really just real analysis, right? That's an advanced calculus theory course. So take some real analysis sometime. And I say it's just real analysis, but that kind of covers things up. We had derivatives starting back in the 1670s in mathematics, but it wasn't until the middle part of the 1800s, almost 200 years later, that mathematicians were kind of satisfied that derivatives were a thing and we could live with them. Okay, so there's actually quite a lot there, but as far as we're concerned, it's just a slope. Okay, so if you were ignoring things, try to go ahead and come back to us now. So let's go back to population. We could ask a question about, given this year's population, what is next year's population? Okay, and there's a regression approach to answering that model, right? If you know the birth rates and the death rates, and those are assumed for now to be constant, but we could let them vary sometime, then it turns out that the population at some time t is whatever the starting population is, times 1 plus the birth rate plus minus the death rate raised to the t, whatever the year is, whatever the time is. That also covers compound interest and things like that. So there's a regression approach to this. But we could also take a dynamical systems approach to this. What is next year's population? Autoregression is mostly a dynamic approach to things. We could write next year's population in terms of this year's population. That is, population at t plus 1 is the population at t times 1 plus the birth rate plus the death rate. Right? So we have this nice linear autoregression That allows us to get the same information. If you wanted to, we could do the population at t+2. And that's the population at t+1 times that quantity in parentheses. But then we could substitute this in for the population at t+1, and we'd recover the original regression approach, right? We just iterate through this. Typically, in these models, we sort of think about time as being discrete, not continuous, even though we all know time's a continuous thing. It just keeps flowing. We're going to ignore this detail. However, if you do computational studies, if you're in computer science, if you've had a numerical analysis course, you probably know all about the fact that you really shouldn't confuse discrete and continuous stuff because they behave much differently. Well, that's kind of a boring model. So let's consider a population model with what's called a carrying capacity. This is going to take, again, a dynamical approach to population. And it was Sir Ronald May that in 1976 sort of introduced this back into biology. The particular thing he did is actually much older, but it sort of got lost along the way, and he reintroduced it and did a lot of nice things with it. So the components that we're going to consider are the normalized population. It's basically you divide the population by the carrying capacity. And then the population velocity, that is the change in population each year. And here are the rules. The population next year is some constant times the population this year times 1 minus the population this year plus some error term, right? There's always an error term for things that happen. And then the derivative of the population next year is that same constant times the population this year times 1 minus the population this year minus the population this year plus some other random error term, right? Now, a couple of things. We've reduced everything to where the population is actually this normalized population. And all of the birth and death rate stuff has been kind of rolled into that constant R. I'm not going to go through the derivations. We don't need them tonight. The Greek letters at the end, again, are just the error terms. And for all the mathematicians in the audience, even though I've denoted the left-hand side in the second equation as a derivative, I know it's really just a derivative estimate. We're not really taking the derivative because we have a discrete time. We don't have this continuous time and 2 points close together. So don't complain, okay? Just don't complain. So in this dynamical approach, we're just considering population of one particular species, but we can easily extend this to predator-prey models and things like that. For example, there's some very good data out there on the historical Canadian lynx populations and the hares in Canada. And you can do some nice things with it, right? So for now, all we need is these equations. So here's some data based on those equations. These are simulated data, but it's still those equations. Anybody out there see a pattern? You can raise your hand and tell Dr. Salvatelli, do you see a pattern?
Anybody?
Yeah, right. No, you don't find a pattern, right? There's no pattern there. Okay? The eye test doesn't get it, but that's okay. We have mathematics. So let's do a regression. We can do a linear regression, and it turns out that we get those particular values. Notice we get a significant intercept at about 0.5. And if you looked carefully, you saw that the scale went from 0 to 1. It's basically the average. And we get a non-significant slope. We could do an autoregression model, right? Just sort of a basic autoregression. And if you try an autoregression, you come back with an ARIMA, an autoregressive model. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it for now, with a mean of 0.5. In other words, we can't find anything. The autoregression doesn't find anything. And it turns out even if you use terms up to lags of 500, you find nothing. So neither the regression model nor the linear autoregression model work well. And somebody says, oh, well, I could try a nonlinear model. Well, you can do a quadratic regression. You still find an intercept of 0.5 and nothing significant. However, I can change this to looking at the state space. And notice here, instead of plotting the time on the horizontal axis and the population on the vertical axis, I've plotted the population on the horizontal axis and the population velocity on the vertical axis. My guess is now you do see a pattern. Right? Now it's very clear that there's a sort of parabolic thing. This is actually known as a delay state space, not a state space, but I don't particularly care for tonight. Clearly there's a pattern though, right? And it turns out if you fit this with a quadratic model, you get a nice fit. Well, that shouldn't be a surprise, right? May's original model was a quadratic model. The data were generated from quadratic. But the point here is that sometimes changing from a non-dynamic model or a non-dynamic plot to a state space approach can give you a lot of insight. So there's the sort of basics of why we might want to do some of the dynamics. The social behavioral sciences. I don't know what your majors are, but if you're anything like the data science students we had, you would be like, out of every 10 of you, there might be one social behavioral science person. There were probably 6 business, finance, economics people, and there are a few math, computer science people, and maybe a physicist thrown in there. But the social behavioral sciences then ask questions like these. How do I feel today? Where do I live? What level of support am I receiving from family and friends? And so on. These questions typically have answers that are a result of 2 things. First, yesterday's answers go a long way to predicting today's answers and determining today's answers, right? If I was getting a lot of family support yesterday, I'm probably going to get a lot of family support today. So where I live today is causally related to where I lived yesterday. Until I change jobs, I probably don't move that much, right? So a dynamical systems approach focuses on those things where we think about what happens internally as a result of what's going on inside of you. There are also external things that happen. I move. There's a traumatic event, all sorts of things. We're going to put those aside for now. Although I have to say, there's not a whole lot of stuff done, but I was at a conference just a little over a week ago where somebody was doing something known as reservoir computing. And I had a great conversation with the presenter of that paper where they're trying to recover the noise from a system instead of recovering the signal. And so we talked, and we think there may be a chance to recover some of the external uncorrelated events using reservoir computing, but that's an aside thing and I haven't really looked at it. But the dynamical systems approach, notice, aligns well with the social behavioral sciences. Social behavioral sciences sees dynamical systems as familiar. It's the same phenomenon questions, and completely unfamiliar because nobody in the social behavioral sciences gets those methods. There are some problems with using dynamical systems in the social behavioral sciences. So my dissertation was in acoustics. I collected 16,000 samples a second, continuous data. I basically directly measured it, 14-bit precision. That is, the standard error was about 0.006%. It was easily repeatable. I could always replace a violin string with another violin string. And I didn't need to go through an institutional review board. I didn't need to get permission to abuse these violins. Social behavioral sciences, like a post-trauma study, are different. First of all, we can only collect 1, maybe 2 samples a day. We get ordinal or categorical data. There's a latent construct, say post-traumatic distress is a latent construct, but it's measured by these Likert scales. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much did you blank? Right? Because it's a Likert scale, there's nothing you can do to talk about standard errors and standard deviations and stuff. Those are meaningless concepts if you don't have continuous numeric variables. Yeah, it's never the same. People are idiosyncratic. Everybody's different. And lastly, you do need to get an IRB because you really shouldn't be abusing people the same way that I abused violin strings. So dynamical systems measures assume we have things like on the left, even though we have things that are on the right. For now, we're going to hold our nose and just go ahead and do it while we try to work out details. The other thing that the social behavioral sciences have that we don't see a lot in the physical sciences, mathematical sciences, are latent variables. Most things in the social behavioral sciences are not directly observable. For example, IQ is a latent variable. We don't just observe IQ. We say, oh, based on your response to these questions, you have that IQ. And this is why the sort of science spiral is so important. Not just the scientific method, but you have to spiral. Once you get to the end, you have to go back and say, okay, now what are the new questions? But because a lot of things are latent variables, we also consider that there may be latent classes. Some people, when they experience a trauma, end up with PTSD. Some people don't. And so we try to balance the idiographic, everybody's an individual, and the nomothetic, one-size-fits-all desires that scientists have. And so we have to include latent classes in our model selection. Turns out most dynamical systems approaches, because they come from the physical sciences, don't deal with latent variables and classes. And there's the first big problem. Second big problem is all dynamical systems in the physical and in mathematical and engineering sciences have characteristic timescales. And a lot of times we can derive those. Most social behavioral science theorizing and empirical design ignore timescales, even though we know they're there. Right? There are evolutionary psychologists who talk on timescales that are much greater than a developmental psychologist. That is much greater in timescale than an educational psychologist or a cognitive psychologist. There's something known as the Nyquist theorem from acoustics. You have to take your data at least twice as frequently as the highest frequency phenomena you investigate. Okay? And the upshot of all of this is that social behavioral sciences are not rocket science. They are much harder than rocket science. Rocket science is easy. So, all these problems is that you need good science and not just good statistics to make any headway. Okay? And in this, machine learning is currently of limited help. Some of the stuff that Cynthia Rudin does with interpretable machine learning can be helpful, but a lot of this stuff is not going to help us because it doesn't help us produce new theories. It just makes predictions. So, there's a lot more in what we'll do here tonight, but let's look at some dynamical systems approaches to things. There are things that we won't do is we won't look at patterns and distributions. We won't look at things like heavy tails, things that say you can have extreme events, unlike normality. We won't look at recurrence quantification analysis or dynamic mode decomposition, which probably is my favorite because it's sort of the great grandchild intellectually of the stuff I did in graduate school with Fourier analysis. But instead here, we're going to look at three. We'll look at something known as dynamical systems analysis, which is unfortunately named because all of these are dynamical systems analyses. We'll look at Cindy, and we'll look at a Markov model extended to what's known as network psychometrics. So, if you're lucky enough to have known the differential equation or have some theory of saying you have a differential equation, and a differential equation just means you have an equation and it has derivatives in it. That's it. Okay. But you may have a differential equation just like you would have a linear regression equation with unknown coefficients. If you have that, dynamical systems analysis is your thing. You include both the levels that are measured and maybe velocities, accelerations, whatever, and then you estimate the coefficients. However, you also have to estimate the derivatives from the time series, and that's tricky. It's very difficult. And then we'll estimate the coefficients, but the data are time series, and each wave of data is nested inside a person. So I'm going to measure Dr. Salvatelli for 30 days. I'm going to measure me for 30 days. I'm going to measure you for 30 days. Because of that, we don't expect those data to meet the IID requirement of regression. And so we have to do something known as multi-level modeling. If you don't use multi-level modeling, all of your estimates will be unbiased. And all of your standard errors will be completely meaningless, meaning that you can do no inference whatsoever. So that's why we need multi-level modeling, is the inference. You can make the estimates, you just can't do any inference without it. So to estimate the velocities, we could do the slope. This we introduced earlier. Fortunately, this is biased and it's noisy and it has lots of problems with missing data, and it introduces collinearity because then on both sides of the equation, you may have x of t. And collinearity, as you probably know, causes problems in regression. So there are other approaches to estimating derivatives. My favorite is to use functional data analysis. It uses something known as splines. And a spline was originally a drafting tool. It was a very thin, flexible piece of wood, and you could put some points down, some pins on the diagram, and then you could bend this spline there and then trace the curve. Okay, we can do that mathematically. A lot of times people use something known as the generalized orthogonal local derivatives because they're helpful for multi-level modeling. They reduce collinearity a lot. It's not clear to me or to others that that's actually measuring a derivative, but it gets used that way, and many others. So Chip Knight, who's the executive director out at Lyda Hill, and I have something that as of today is now under review. We looked at some wildfire survivors, and it was from the 2018 wildfire season. And we modeled the velocity of distress, not their distress, but the velocity of distress modeled by their post-traumatic growth. And so D is the distress, and it's the velocity of distress, modeled by the level of post-traumatic growth and the velocity of post-traumatic growth and the acceleration of post-traumatic growth, right? Three terms. And yes, we find a significant beta 2, that is the velocity of post-traumatic growth, is a significant predictor of distress. But even more useful was this. We modeled the distress level, the zeroth derivative, in a similar fashion. So notice the two equations are the same, except on the left-hand side, it's level in the bottom and it was velocity in the top. And it turns out that the beta 3, the predictor of, or the coefficient that goes with the post-traumatic acceleration, was significant, but that the post-traumatic level itself was not significant. Okay? And this is really important because there are a lot of conflicting findings in the literature. If we just measure distress level, modeled only on post-traumatic growth level, sometimes beta is positive, sometimes it's negative, sometimes it seems to be not significant. Nobody knows anything. We think it's because they haven't included all the terms in the model. You need to include some of these derivative terms in the model for it to work. We can talk about sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics, SINDY. The nice thing about SINDY is you don't need a theory. To do the stuff that we just looked at, you have to have some reason to believe this is the differential equation. If I don't know what the differential equation is, I can use SINDY. You choose a big library of possible functions. We'll choose all the polynomials up to 6th order, and we'll throw in sine and cosine, and what the heck, we'll throw in exponential decay. And it uses ordinary least squares regression, type of thing you've always done, with something known as regularization. Regularization is a technique that deals with multicollinearity, and it removes terms that aren't necessary. And it's very good at that. You have to play around a little bit with it, but it works out well. And so we use that on this big library of functions to determine what functions need to be there. Okay? And the nice thing about this is it will generate then differential equations that we can first of all use to help scaffold theory. We can say, oh, well, we see velocity squared show up. What does that mean to us? We see this term show up. Right? We also can use it to find fixed points. And the fixed point is just where something would have a velocity of 0. And most of the time we think about fixed points in terms of being sources or sinks. You can think about an attractive fixed point as being something where everything flows towards. And you can think about a repelling or an unstable fixed point as being something where everything flows away from. We can also create latent classes. And I'll show you some results from using a genetic algorithm to create those latent classes. So fixed points, that's where it's not changing. That is the first derivative 0. So here's what you do. Let's find the level points at which the velocity of the level is 0. That is, we're going to take our dependent variable to be the velocity, our independent variable to be the level, and we're just going to do a regression. Okay, so here's a nice linear regression. Right? Velocity or first derivative is on the left side, and then the level's on the right side. Once you've regressed that, you set the velocity equal to 0, and you solve to find where the velocity is 0, this fixed point. Okay? And now once we have that fixed point, and here's some data, and the black continuous line is the line of best fit. Notice the velocity is on the vertical axis, the level is on the horizontal axis, and this blue line marks where the velocity regression line crosses velocity 0. That is, it tells us exactly where our fixed point should be, 3.99. It also tells us a little something more. What happens if I were to be at 3.99, my velocity is 0, I'm at rest, and something perturbs me a little bit? I get knocked a little bit to a lower level. Well, if I get knocked to a lower level, notice that the regression tells me the velocity will now be positive, which would push me right back to where I was. Similarly, if I was nice and relaxed and at this point, if I got knocked up a little bit, the velocity is negative, and I would go back down, pushing me again back towards that equilibrium point. So we would say that here is a stable equilibrium point because any perturbation tends to get undone. If the velocity versus level slope were positive, notice it would be unstable because if you knock me a little bit too high, I would keep going away. Knock me a little bit too low, I keep going away. So we can talk about fixed points as being attractors or repellers. So what did Chris and I do? We took some of this wildfire data and we had 3 things going on. We used the Coping self-efficacy, we used how much they're distressed by results or new events happening to them, and their post-traumatic growth. And we said, okay, let's fit each person. Let's use Cindy to give us a differential equation for each person. But then we wanted to create latent classes. And again, we want to do latent classes because everybody as an individual isn't very helpful. One size doesn't fit all. So we're trying to balance between those two extremes. We're trying to find that sort of Goldilocks thing. So we put each individual in a random class. We just said, hey, there's 5 classes. I'm going to put you in one of them randomly. Okay, or 4 classes. And we have a way of saying we can change how many classes there are. We just put you that, and let's call that a gene. So here's 20 people in class. The first person's in class 3, the second person's in class 2, the third person's in class 3, and so on. Let's get lots of genes, a huge population of genes, say 1,000. We'll fit each class and each gene via Cindy, and we'll determine its fitness. How good a fit do we get? Right? So how good a fit does this class get? And we can do things like BIC, AIC. Those are things that you've done before, probably for model selection. Right? Decide, is this model better, more parsimonious than this other model? And then we'll take the fittest genes and we'll say, okay, throw out the bottom 10% of the fittest genes and replace them with copies of the top 10% of fittest genes. And then we'll have a bunch of genes mate. We'll choose a crossover point after that third one and say, let's take the first 3 from gene A and the last 17 from gene B, and we'll make that a new gene. And that gives us a new generation. We go back, let's fit it again. Let's find the ones that are best, throw out the ones that are worst, keep the ones that are best, and so on and so forth. And you do this until you get a population that's pretty fit. And I say you have to do this a long time. We've been finding it typically takes 60 or 80 generations, 60 or 80 iterations. So it doesn't take too long to do. Right? So what do we find? So our goal was to be able to predict long-term distress from baseline distress, because we have this these data that we got collecting day after day for 30 days. Okay. However, we also have 6-month follow-up data. What happened to them 5 months after they stopped? And can we figure out how to predict that? So if we just use the baseline distress, what was your baseline on day 1? What was your distress on day 1? And we use that to predict your distress 6 months later. We get an R-squared of about 0.57. Okay. Notice that's not terrible, especially in the social sciences. If you're in the physical sciences, it's terrible. But in the social sciences, 0.57 for an R-squared is pretty good. If we do something known as growth mixture modeling, which is what most people do nowadays, we find an R-squared that's a little bit higher, 0.65. We also find a better BIC, that is, it's a better model. If we do a second order, Cindy, and we just look at the class that you're in, then we do not quite as well as the GMM. However, if we do the second order Cindy, and we look at the fixed point values, remember we can find the fixed points if we know everything, we do better. We get a higher R-squared. Okay? And one other thing that happens, it turns out that when you do things via class, none of the classes are significant predictors. Right? So even though you get a decent BIC, it's not, you don't get any significant predictors. You can't say, oh, people in class 1 are more likely to be higher in distress than people in class 2. And in the second order, Cindy, when you look at the class, you can't do that either. However, if we calculate the fixed point values, we do get significance. We do find that the fixed point value is a significant predictor of what happens later on. And you don't get fixed points from non-dynamical systems. So here we have a way of saying we can take a short-term measurement and predict something that's going to happen a long ways away. That's kind of important in the world I live in. We don't have any therapists out there. Yes, I know there are therapists. Try to get an appointment if you need mental health support, and it's really, really hard because there's not enough therapists to go around. So if we could predict based on some really simple measurements that we could take today, what your need is going to be 6 months from now, that would help the system out immensely. That would also help you out immensely, because if we know you're going to need the support, let's get you the support now. If We don't think you're going to need the support. We're not going to worry about it as much now. Okay? I hate to be economic about that, but that's the world we live in. We don't have enough therapists to go around. Okay? So this is potentially a really useful and interesting result. Okay, third example. We'll talk about Markov matrices, also known as transition matrices. Suppose instead of having numerical values, we had categories. And really, you should know the last two examples, we had ordinal stuff, but we did that sort of hold your nose and be social behavioral scientists and say, well, ordinal is close enough to continuous that we'll treat it as continuous. But suppose you really do have categories, right? We have a categorical data time series. So what we can do is we model the probability of transitions from one state to the next, from one time to the next. So there's a sequence, C, B, B, C, A, and so on. And from that, I can create a transition matrix that I've listed there. And here's what we mean by the transition matrix. That upper left number, 0.5, under the AA, right? It's the AA cell, says that half the time you start in state A, the next time you will be in state A. The top row, the second one, the middle column, the AB column, says that 0.375. That says 3/8 of the time that you start in A, you will end up in B. And then the last one in that row says 1/8 of the time that you start in A, you will end up in C. Well, if you look very carefully, you'll notice that there are, lo and behold, 8 A's. And notice the first A goes to A, the second A goes to A, the third A goes to B, fourth A goes to C, the fifth A goes to A, the sixth A goes to A, the seventh A goes to B, and the eighth A goes to B. Notice 4 of the 8 go to A, 3 of the 8 go to B, 1 of the 8 goes to C. That's exactly what shows up in this first row. Similarly, we can do the same thing to figure out the second row and the third row. If you're really close and paying attention and you like sort of doing arithmetic in your head, you'll notice each row adds up to 1. Every state has to go somewhere. You can't just say, oh, well, I'm here and then I'm gone. Okay? So that's how transition matrix or a Markov matrix. Okay? We can extend that. So many psychological studies use a cross-section of between person contemporaneous data. They do correlations, right? And this includes regression analyses, right? They're basically just correlations. But what happens instead of looking at the same time, which is what people do, what most of the psychometric people do, and what a lot of the psychological studies do, what correlates with what, we look temporally. Within each person, let's look at the state at one time, modeling the state at the next time. Let's think dynamically. So we're going to extend Markov beyond thinking about just an individual's probabilities, but let's think about what happens for everybody across time. This is a lot of times known as network psychometrics. So we'll look at a network psychometric models of data on interpersonal violence perpetrated against women over several years. So the data we're taking a bit more than once a year, so it misses a lot of the things that would have happened day to day. But still we have about 8 years of data, 10 waves of data for, I think it's 260 women overall. Started with about 400 women, but you know, people move, people stop participating for whatever reason and things like that. So this is from a paper that I'm working on with Marianne Dutton, who's down at Georgetown. Over on the left side, we see this sort of network representation of correlations. And you may not have seen correlations represented this way, but this is all it is. The darker the line, the thicker the line means the higher the correlation coefficient. The skinnier the line, the dimmer the line, the weaker correlation coefficient. Greens are positive, reds are negative. And this one, if you're a psychometrician, makes a lot of sense. Over on the left-hand side, we see different strategies that a woman may try to reduce the violence against her. She may do things like placate the person. She may try to resist. She may just give in. She may go to a friend's house. She may try legal things. This relatively thick line from the CT at the top to this LG is trying legal stuff. And those are correlations everybody's well familiar with, at least everybody in that field. The two that are really linked here are the risk of being killed and the risk of being injured. And if you're at risk, you're at risk. So there's a very strong correlation there. In the lower right, we have measures from what's known as the PCL-5, which measures possibilities of post-traumatic stress. And there are 4 components in the PCL, okay? Hypervigilance and dysphoria and avoidance, and the other one, I don't know why I'm blanking on, but it is. And we know that they're pretty well correlated. But suppose we do a time 1 lag. We go from this time to the next time. Notice the structure looks much different. Okay? And we see that now we have to have arrows, and you can see the arrowheads, I hope, that resistance at some time actually reduces the chances of you being violence being perpetrated against you at a later time. Okay? So most of these things turn out to reduce violence, and so they're all good things to do. But it turns out that resistance has the biggest impact. Right? It's the thickest red line. Right? You also notice, though, that parts of the PCL, the distress you feel over here, impacts what you might do to resist the next time. If I have a lot of dysphoria, which is this lower right, I'm likely to try going to a friend or family to escape, which will reduce the chance of violence a little bit. And so the fact that these look very differently temporally than they do contemporaneously is a big deal. Right? Because it tells us what should we encourage people to do to actually break some of these cycles. Right? We'll have to see. The one thing that you will note also that is not surprising is there are some self loops here. Okay? The sort of unfortunate one here is your risk of being killed is a predictor of lowering your risk of being killed next time, because sometimes that risk unfortunately comes to fruition. Okay? So, in summary, the dynamical systems approaches in social behavioral sciences can point out things that non-dynamical approaches cannot. Right? And the dynamical approach is states dependent upon states, not on time. Okay? We see the usefulness of derivatives and other temporal notions that a lot of times get missed. Now, there are a lot of difficulties in social behavioral sciences, and I've ignored most of these, but I just want to be honest and point them out to you again. Latent constructs are tough. They're difficult to deal with regardless. The data collection and the data types that you get in the social behavioral sciences really were never meant to do dynamical systems. They're ordinal data. They're noisy. They're difficult to acquire at appropriate time scales. And you have to estimate the derivatives. You can't measure them. Okay, so there's a lot of difficulties, but they have a lot of things that they work well with. So, having said that, I'm going to stop sharing. And if there are questions or comments or corrections or anything, let me know, and thank you for your time.
Thank Professor Ricca for the great presentation. So first of all, if there is some missing background on linear regression, it's my responsibility, because
Okay.
lots of students here since all my classes, so that's my responsibility. Any questions? Feel free. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Questions about your approach on using linear regression to predict the distress and the variation of distress. I think it's your second example. Do you check things like uncertainty of the prediction? And or do something like study of the variability of estimates and all these type of things, because I'm wondering, because that seems to me a very hard problem.
Yes, it is, and this is one of the things that we end up finding the need for sort of latent classes, for dividing people into these classes of, some people experience distress, some don't, some are delayed onset of symptoms, or some people recover or whatnot. And that is, the latent classes help us reduce the variability in each particular class. And so we stand a better chance of this, because otherwise what you're saying is exactly the problem. Our variability gets to be so large, and little jitters here, we get nothing of significance. And so a lot of our time is spent trying to be careful. We don't want to go fishing and say, oh, well, let's just find something that will support our theory, right? Because that's ethically just wrong. But we're trying to do the best we can to reduce the variability that's there, or reduce the impact of the variability, I should say. The variability is just there, so that we can make progress. Because it is, it's so unlike what I was doing when I was a physicist. It's like in physics, oh yeah, we get these great data, and R squared is 0.999 and higher. Here we're not getting that sort of thing. So what you're asking is exactly one of the things we have to deal with all the time. And it's sort of the ongoing stuff that I work with, especially with some of my statistics friends, is okay, is there some way we can do better about this? Because the sensitivity of things to noise is really quite striking sometimes.
Awesome. Other questions or comments?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep,
go ahead.
yep, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So you mentioned like interpretable modeling and how like for the social sciences,
Yep.
a lot of the machine learning stuff hasn't been super helpful.
Yep.
I'm curious where you think that will go. Like, is there, because I mean, with interpretable model, you're looking to return to, like you said, some like principle or theory or something that you
Right.
can use. I guess it seems like there's been an acceleration towards more uninterpretable modeling.
Yeah.
I guess, sorry.
It's okay.
I guess my question is like, is there room for uninterpretable modeling, or like what
There,
advancements do you see happening with the interpretable modeling side of things?
so there is, right, machine learning is one of these sort of wild open fields right now. And there's lots of good stuff and bad stuff there. There is a place for the uninterpretable models, for the black box models. Certainly when you get into fields like finance, they don't care what the theory is. They just want to know, is this stock going to go up or down? Can I make an extra penny? Because if you make an extra penny on 7,000 shares, you just made, $70. Okay. There is some, because a lot of times what we need is to say, oh, who should we go after in terms of trying to intervene now? And so we're going to do triage. And if you think about it in terms of triage in the mental health field, machine learning is fine, because it's going to say, oh yeah, these are the people most likely to need help. Let's get them help now. Okay. As triage, that's great. At some point, you'd like to move beyond triage. Right? When the ER is completely overloaded, you do triage. But that doesn't help you understand what needs to happen. And so the uninterpretable machine learning will help in the mental health fields, will help in the social behavioral sciences, in those triage situations. Right? But what it's not going to help, and here are the two things where there's going to be problems, is it's not ever going to allow us to understand the ongoing dynamics to refine what we're thinking about and to refine our measurements, right? Because part of what this cycle of, when you learn something, you get a new theory, you get a new hypothesis, you learn to make measurements of different things. Machine learning is not helping us do that. And so we're going to be stuck with the measurements, and we'll get up to a certain level, and that's as far as we'll go. And beyond that, we're going to need new measures. Machine learning is not, the uninterpretable is not helping us with that. The interpretable has some possibility that it will help us with these things. Okay. So there's the first reason why I think the interpretable will help us some. The uninterpretable, it'll help, but it's going to be ceilinged out at some point. Okay. It's a triage thing, and it's going to get stuck here. The other thing, and if you read books like Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, all the machine learning models, they're trained on some set of data. And if you don't have the right set of data, you're not going to have the right outcomes. We don't currently know, because we don't know the theory well enough. We don't know what the right set of data is that we should be training models on. And so therefore, we don't know enough to make best advantage of the uninterpretable machine learning. Okay. And so there's the second piece. We just don't know what to put into it. So we're going to get out what it gives us, but that's just sort of enculturating our biases into that thing. Okay. And so, yeah, machine learning's got a place. And some people, again, in the finance world, in the quantitative trading world, they really don't care sometimes. It's simply, if you can tell me to make this stock move a few seconds ahead of my competitors, I can sell, I can dump 7 million shares of stock before they know what's going on, and I just made some money. Okay, so it really depends upon what you're trying to do. But in the social behavioral sciences, there's a lot of theory we need. Right? We're talking about what's the best way to teach students. Turns out we really suck at teaching students. No offense, Alessandro or anybody else, but we do. We basically suck at teaching students. You all seem to learn, but we're not very good at it. Okay, so we need something better than that. So does that get at your question?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would ask is I sort of have like this, like on the personal side, like an epistemological concern with the
Yeah,
growth of like uninterpretable modeling.
yeah.
I guess like just like personally, is that a concern you share as well? Because like as you mentioned, like the triage approach, um, it's well, I would think that it would be easier and require less work, and it'd be like it required less investment if you're looking for just figuring out or just doing something right now. But yeah,
Right.
like in the long term, like figuring stuff out
Yeah.
requires not that.
Yeah. I mean, epistemology bothers me a lot, and not just about machine learning, incidentally. Right. The fact that we use non-dynamical approaches for dynamical systems, there's an epistemological mismatch there. And so we do a lot of these things. And this is one of the things that again, you get a syllabus at the beginning of every semester in pretty much every class. That tells you what's going on. And I had a very good friend who was a big name in curriculum theory, and he always used to produce his syllabi at the end of the semester. So that way they're accurate. They can tell us what we actually did. It's because in the first day of class, I don't know anything about you. I have no idea what's going on. And he says, it's going to take me a couple of weeks before I have any idea what I should be doing with you. And so it's actually unethical to produce a syllabus ahead of time. Now, it really annoyed his dean for 30 years for him to do that, but he's got a point. We don't ethically have a good match between the method and what we're studying. And when we don't have that epistemological mismatch, there's some ethic issues. There's lots of things like that bother me greatly. I try to avoid them, but it can't be done. But yeah, I have to keep that in mind all the time. And that's part of the reason, incidentally, I keep machine learning at arm's breadth. I mean, I've taught that course once, and it's like, okay, yeah, I can do all those sorts of things, but yeah, I really don't want to do it. So it's a good point you make.
Awesome. Other questions? The other thing I can mention is that in your examples, basically you touch topics that the students of my class are working on for the project. More or less all of them. And I would say that we didn't pre-decide. I mean, I didn't input you on the type of examples that you're making, because more or less you touch all of the examples. Maybe the ecology one, you did shallow lakes, you explained the predator prey, but basically other than that, you touch all the examples or all the tools that I've used.
And basically, I picked the ones that I'm working on that are sitting on my desktop right now, right? Because as a research associate professor, basically I'm the hired gun for a lot of projects. And so I do the statistics and the dynamical systems, and we have lots of nice discussions and theorizing and things like that. But it's basically like this. So I have this list of projects, and those are the 3 right now that I'm like, oh yeah, these have to get out. The one, Chip and I just got out the door today. The Cindy one, Chris and I were hoping to get it out the door, and then we're like, oh no, this is going to require a whole lot more explaining to a psychology audience. So it's not out the door. I was hoping to have a draft to him today, or the next draft. Well, I'll have a draft to him Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then the last one, because I was supposed to have Chris's out Friday to him, I was going to work on the paper with Marianne today. It's like, okay, these are the ones that I'm actually doing right now. So that's why I chose them. It had nothing to do with anything Alessandro had assigned or that you guys were doing. I didn't know anything about that. So just great minds think alike, maybe.
All right, good. One last question maybe before we let Professor Ricca go. No? Well, if not, let's thank Dr. Ricca. Yes,
let's go ahead. Yeah.
I'd say, what was the book that you mentioned at the very beginning? Do you remember?
The book at the very beginning. Oh, Zenil's book. Let's see if I can grab you the
one from like 30 years ago.
Oh, the one from 30 years ago. That was Esther Thelen, Thelen, and there's probably Do I have a chat or something that I can throw this in?
Yeah. You should be able to have a chat on the right part of the window. And
oh yeah, it's yeah, there it is, little chat. Okay, it's Thalen and Smith, 1994.
Oh yeah, that one, yeah.
A dynamical systems approach to development of cognition and action. And when you look at that, you need to be careful because there's a second book. It's Smith and Thalen, 1995, which is sort of applications of this. But the first 4 chapters of that, I mean, it's a great book for all of psychology, but the first 4 chapters, that doesn't require you to understand, lots of psychology. They'll talk about people you may not know, but they're talking about infants learning how to walk. And so it doesn't require this sort of great in-depth psychology knowledge. And what they say about dynamical system is just brilliant, even to this day. It's probably the best I've seen. So, and it's one of the books that instead of sitting on the bookshelf behind me, sits right here on my desk. And after I have it memorized some decade from now or something, I will not have to have it on my desk, but until then it stays here.
I appreciate it. It was originally when he introduced me to the Dynamical Systems project, I got really excited. I watched a few different lectures online just because it is like this interpretable modeling method where you can return to the original governing equations. So that's awesome. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And the thing to remember about Thalen and Smith is they were working long before most of the stuff around. People were doing Markov matrices, but they weren't doing the network psychometrics. That's the last 6 years. And the Cindy paper was what, 2016 was Brunton's paper. And the dynamical systems analysis, Steve Boker was doing that around 2007, 2008. So their stuff predates all of these things, which makes it, I think, even more astonishing. Linda Smith is still, she's just down the road from you. She's down at Bloomington, I think, still. She's an emeritus professor down there, but she's there. Esther Thalen sadly passed away 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but she was also down at Bloomington. She's one of the most brilliant people I've ever had the pleasure to encounter.
Awesome. So thanks a lot.
You're most welcome.
For your time and also for your kind answer to our questions. So thank you very much for being here and giving a talk in the
welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
You all take care. Bye bye.
Okay, stop the recording. Okay.